you should know that Darwinism, unlike some of the other sciences, does not tell us a literally true story about what happened in the past. The evidence doesn't allow for that.
It seems that a few big ideas that are wrong have been embedded into the culture.
If life was a chemical event, it happened on the molar scale. That is 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd, because that's how chemical reactions run. Since we've descended below the level of the cell into chemistry, now we have Schwab's view saying that basically this: biological diversity is an initial condition that started at the origin of life. Biological diversity is not something that grows up in a tree. It starts out as a forest. So, what's super interesting about that? There's actually a different way of approaching this that's more proximate to the way scientists derive beliefs from their data. But scientists don't study the nature of science or the nature of scientific paradigms. The philosophy of science, the history and philosophy of science, studies scientific revolutions, scientific paradigms as paradigms, and then it's epistemology that really governs, I think, those principles in the philosophy of science. And so I'm trying to find a more proximate way of resolving the conflict between neo-Darwinism and intelligent design by building out a different philosophical framework based on an epistemological solution, not a metaphysical one.
Okay, so for
helpful,
it is. I want to kind of back up just a hair, just to lay a little bit of groundwork in case we just lost anybody. So if you can define for me basically what is Darwinism, how is it different than neo-Darwinism, how are both of those different from intelligent design in terms of paradigm, and then what is your paradigm when you're talking about, like, to go back to the title of your book, a post-Darwinian design theory, maybe just kind of like in a basic manner defining like what are we talking about here in terms of paradigms?
Okay, so yeah, this is good. And then maybe we'll throw in the distinction between like intelligent design and creationism. That would be, I think that might help flesh out those categories. So Darwinism, the original project, Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859, I think. So this is why the title is of my book is Beyond Origin. So so Darwin starts. Oh gosh, I got myself in trouble by doing a much more elaborated view of this. Okay, shortcut. Darwin writes Origin of Species as a scientific paradigm shift from William Paley's natural theology. William Paley, a relatively immutable species in a local environment in the recent past, right? So Darwin, relatively mutable species in transient environments over geologic time, right? So Darwin's idea, he really borrows from the geologist Charles Lyell from the 1830s. And he says, the idea of catastrophism versus gradualism. So that small incremental changes over long periods of time can lead up to large changes. So think of a river running through a valley. Over 300 million years creates a canyon, right? The canyon doesn't have to have been created by, say, Noah's flood or some catastrophic event. The large change that we see can be incremental over time. So Darwin borrows that idea from geology and says, I've noticed that species are not as immutable as William Paley says, because pigeon breeding and cows and sheep, we know that we can artificially select traits. Think of dog breeders, right? Mm-hmm. So he goes, well, what if there was a kind of natural selection, and it was the kind of slow incremental change that nature did on species over long periods of time? One thing could transmute into another, right? So that's the sort of orthodox original Darwinism. And then in the 1940s, you have the discovery of genetics. So the gene, not the cell, but now the gene is Mendelian genetics. And so we find gene expression and gene mutations, and we go, okay, because in Darwin's original Origin of Species, he talks about variations within a kind. So some change happens. Well, now the neo-Darwinist says that variation is what we know as a genetic mutation. So there's a mutation in the way a gene is expressed. That expression, some of those expressions are going to be beneficial for the species, and that benefit is going to cause that particular variation in the species to become dominant, and then that's going to change over time. So that's the Darwinism, and then the neo-Darwinism is the addition of genetic mutation as the natural selection acting on mutation as sort of the mechanism by which this change happens over geologic time.
So would you say, just
Yeah.
to tackle those first two, is it basically a deepening of understanding of the mechanism within the same paradigm in the shift
Yes.
from, okay, got it. So there's
Yeah.
no sense of that Darwinism was wrong and now we're shifting the paradigm into a different direction. It's just, oh, now we know more about this same concept.
Exactly. And this is if we get to it, this will be helpful in the future, because this is how young paradigms start. They start with mechanisms that the function of which is perhaps unclear. We can see that there's a function there, but we don't exactly know how it works, which is how Darwin starts. And then it's whatever, 80 years later that Mendelian genetics gives us the language and function of the thing that is being acted upon, right, in natural selection. So there's nothing untoward about that. That's fairly common in the history of the sciences. So yes, the modern synthesis is when neo-Darwinism starts. So it's synthesizing, it's bringing together this view of natural history with this new science of genetics, and it's saying
Got it.
that the genetics element explains what we've been thinking in terms of evolutionary biology. So intelligent design, really the most recent sort of grandfather of intelligent design was I think Philip Johnson in his Darwin on Trial. It's Darwin. I mean, there are thinkers before that. Michael Denton writes Evolution of Theory in Crisis in '85. I think Dr. Norman Geisler and Kirby Anderson write Origin Science in like 1988, which is trying to get at the nature of what this paradigm is. But really in 91, 92, Philip Johnson writes Darwin on Trial, and then he brings together people like William Densky and Stephen Meyer and Michael Behe. So in the 90s, those guys really start the intelligent design movement. And intelligent design is committed to the idea that there are features of the world whose best explanation is intelligence rather than sort of mindless matter in motion, which would be a materialism. And so you can see from the outset that the aim of the project, the movement, was to unseat materialism as the dominant metaphysics for the natural sciences. And one of the things about metaphysics is, and Joseph Owens will call metaphysics a habit. Again, dropping names here. Back in 2017, I was able to share the stage with J.P. Moreland and Jay Richards, and we were just doing a panel discussion about Christianity and the sciences. And the question came up about whether science was inherently in conflict with Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And my response was, no. There are some places in Scripture where he talks about the origin of the universe or the origin of man, where you could get some conflict between the way you read Scripture and the way the sciences are read. But what's really at issue here is that when a person gets into the natural sciences and is trained in that mode, they're trained to think naturalistically, right? And so they develop a habit of naturalism as a metaphysics. Now, and that is obviously directly in conflict with a theistic view. So intelligent design really grew up. Philip Johnson, who's trained in law, right? His background, he's a professor of law, and one of the things that philosophers and lawyers sort of have in common is an interest in language and logic, right? So, what does the term mean? I mean, anybody who's read a contract is interested in what does this term mean? What is its extension and intention? And then what is the logic of the argument? So Philip Johnson really starts on that hand, sort of trying to tease out the rhetoric that surrounds the discussion about Darwinism in the culture. And then Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box, it's a biochemical challenge to the mechanisms involved, and that Mike thinks that there are systems within the body that are too they're too complex and fragile. That is, they're really easy to break and they're really hard to build. And so something as clumsy a mechanism as natural selection acting over geologic time could never have been responsible, for example, for the blood clotting cascade, right? Because you need things turning on and off in the right sequence. And if any one of those 14 steps is broken, the whole thing is broken and the animal dies, right? So then William Dembski comes along. William Dembski's Bill's background is in mathematics, statistics, information theory. And so Bill, if you read The Design of Life that Bill wrote with Jonathan Wells, co-wrote with Jonathan Wells, he says that irreducible complexity is a qualitative notion. Specified complexity or complex specified information is a strictly mathematical notion. It arises out of the disciplines of statistics and information theory. And so what Bill did in his design inference, I think the subtitle was eliminating chance through small probabilities. And so Bill develops this understanding of like an upper probability boundary, where if you have an event whose probability is less than, say, 1 times 10 to the negative 150th, you have exhausted all the matter in the known universe, its fastest rate of speed, and the time that we've had since the Big Bang. So any event whose probability is less than that, chance is not a good explanation for it. And so theism becomes a better option. So this is sort of in a nutshell, the way intelligent design argues. Now notice, when I mentioned all of those things, biochemistry, rhetoric, mathematics, and information theory, none of that has anything to do with the book of Genesis. So creationism, because you'll see, I'll see Stephen Meyer interviewed, and it'll say creationist says, I'm like, Stephen Meyer has a PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge. So it's a bit of a misnomer, but
well,
creation,
even can I just say on that
ahead.
point really quick that when I was preparing my podcast with Stephen Meyer, and the first thing that jumped out at me when I just Googled his name, just like, let's start really basic, really broad, Google his name, and then let's work down from there. And I want to craft questions that are basically not merely through my vantage point into him, but through what anyone else would get. And the first thing that I noticed is that the Wikipedia page for Stephen Meyer defines him as a pseudoscientist, because to your point, it defines science as methodological naturalism, right? Like it has to be explained materialistically, or else it isn't scientific in nature. And I asked him that question, and he talked about sort of the demarcation problem, and sort of this is all of what you're talking about, the a prioris that are coming in. But I just wanted to kind of say that in the same way that his L3 will put creationist, even on just Google his name, and immediately it's like pseudoscientist.
Yeah. So I want to be clear. I am a philosopher, and my main area is epistemology, that is theories of human knowing. And then as sort of a secondary competency, I've studied a lot of the history and philosophy of science. And so at no point am I making strictly empirical claims, which is I think why the thesis gets it gets complicated for a lot of people, because philosophy is a very different discipline than the natural sciences, and it can be inaccessible without some really without genuine curiosity. I remember when I first started studying philosophy, I read this article on agnosticism, and I mean, I'm a relatively intelligent guy. I just didn't get it, but I think I read the thing 3 or 4 times, because every time it started to sink in a little bit more, and I started to understand where the argument was going and what the categories were. So, yeah, it's not for the faint of heart, but for those who are passionate and curious, I think there's real benefit there. Yeah, so the intelligent design guys really, I mean, the derogatory way of looking at them is creationism in a tuxedo or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But really, creationism, and I consider myself some form of creationist, is someone who takes, to whatever degree, seriously the revelation that we have in the Book of Genesis.
Right.
And there are myriad ways of parsing that out in an orthodox way. And so my curiosity was to try and tackle the issue of Darwinism from an epistemological perspective, match it up with current intelligent design literature in a way that I was satisfied with. And what I mean by that is this: intelligent design, by its nature, is not a good theoretical replacement for neo-Darwinism. And this is kind of what the video was getting at. And the reason is, and this is the sort of the biggest deficiency I see in the intelligent design world, is people who think that, well, it's either Darwinism or it's intelligent design. And to my ear, that's like saying you either go to the movies or you go to the live theater, right? It's like, well, yeah, these are both theaters, but they're not theaters in the same way, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe that's a bad analogy. I don't know.
Is this a similar point as I've heard John Lennox make, where basically engineering and Henry Ford are both responsible for the formation of the automobile, or is this a different point?
I'm not sure. I'd have to revisit what John's saying there.
He essentially says agency and mechanism do not compete. There are two different explanations that are both required in order to have a complete explanation. So if you're talking only about like the mechanisms of neo-Darwinism, that's not competing against the intelligent designer of those mechanisms.
Right. Yeah. So I'm not making that point specifically. That is a good point to be made. It's not what I'm after here.
So what did you mean about the theater and the?
Oh, I don't know. The analogy may be lost. I'm gonna go back to what I was actually saying, and then maybe,
Sure.
Maybe a better analogy will emerge. One of the philosophers of science that I'm heavily influenced by is Thomas Kuhn, and in his book Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he talks about how a body of scientists, they won't give up a paradigm unless they have a replacement paradigm, right? And a definition of a replacement paradigm is one that looks at the same body of data and then gives an alternative interpretation of that body, like a gestalt, an alternative interpretation of that body of data, and potentially answers some of the anomalies that the old paradigm couldn't. In Kuhn's model, a paradigm exists, anomalies start to build up. Some significant portion of the scientific community thinks that these anomalies are too significant to maintain the old paradigm, and then at some point there's a switch to a new paradigm that brings in all the old data and explains some of the anomalies. You don't see the intelligent design community doing that. What you see them doing is you see them raising anomalies to neo-Darwinism and then rejecting neo-Darwinism without offering a similar paradigm. Now, what I mean by a similar paradigm is there are questions, there are evidences within neo-Darwinism that drive that the paradigm is interested to answer. Genetic mutations, the fossil record, genetic and morphological similarities in biodiversity, right? ID doesn't answer those. In fact, there's I think in his Design Revolution, William Dembski says, well, the panda's thumb might have come about by Darwinian mechanisms, but that still doesn't answer the question about these information-rich um, things that we find at the level of like molecular biology, biochemistry. And then in one blog article responding to a critic, Bill says intelligent design stakes its claims at the level of molecular biology. You go, well, and then furthermore, in his The Design of Life with Jonathan Wells, he says that um, this information analysis. Remember, we said Bill's background was statistics, information, right? He says that you can't run this complexity analysis on a whole organism like an eye because the complexities would quickly mount and become unwieldy. He says you have to pick a system of the right size and type to run your complexity analysis on. Otherwise, the numbers just don't make any sense. That they're just too big, right? Okay, stop. If you're telling me that your tool for analysis is so mathematically precise and robust that it has to pick on very, very small systems within an organism, within an organ, within an organism,
Mm-hmm.
then how is it that intelligent design as a science, if it's an, and I think it's an informational science, how is it going to offer an alternative explanation of the fossil record, right? Organisms as they change historically over time in this sort of clunky qualitative macro level, it just doesn't. And so where intelligent design becomes most scientific, I think, is in its mathematical information analysis. But it's exactly because of that that it can't. It just doesn't have the tools to offer an alternative natural history, say. So we have to look for something else, and that's why I approach the paradigm analysis the way I do.
But what, just to back up a second to the idea of so actually let's go to the origin of life for a second, because I think that that's very relevant in the sense that, as far as I understand, Darwin didn't really address it. So he's talking about everything once you have life to modern man, right?
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
okay?
yeah.
So
Single cell starts with at this level of the cell, and then diversifies from there.
right. So I think that at least part of what the intelligent design community is aiming at exposing is the fact that if you're going to use Darwinism or neo-Darwinism to explain away the need for any God, which I've heard certain people do online,
Sure.
then that is definitely a misfire, in that you're beginning with something that you haven't explained. Like you're pulling a cell out of a hat like a magician, and then going forward from there, but you haven't provided any explanation for not only the single cell, but the, like, now we know about all of the vast amount of information inside of that cell and complexity inside of that cell. So it's like you're not starting at the beginning, basically, is I think at least one critique of Darwinism. But correct me, or maybe straighten me out there a little bit if you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah. So if a Darwinist were here, they would probably say, look, the and I know this because at least Richard Dawkins has said this. He says the origin of life research is chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
That's somebody else's discipline. That's not mine. He's a zoologist, right? So they can put a question mark in for how exactly life arose in a chemical environment, and then just pick it up from when life has already become complex and reproductive. And they say, that's what our discipline governs: evolutionary biology and zoology and paleontology, right? So our theory governs from um, B to Z, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if we don't have A, because we don't purport to explain A. We pick things up at the level of biology, not chemistry.
But
And
what I'm
so
saying is,
yeah,
I fully track with that. But what I'm saying is, not to go against necessarily Richard Dawkins, but to push back against anyone who, in light of the fact that the theory only deals with B to Z,
hmm
if you're going to try to use it to explain away A, That's what I'm saying is a problem, where people say, I mean, the whole monkey trials and all, there's an entire
Yeah,
history in America of God versus Darwin. And what I'm trying to
yeah.
say is that is what I don't understand. And yet I still see videos pop up on my social media, street conversations with like sort of semi like pseudoscientific people talking to lay people, and they're asking
Hmm.
questions like, is evolution a fact? And the person's like, of course evolution's a fact. Does evolution mean that now we have science to prove that there is no God or no need for God? Yeah, that's totally been done away with. That's what I'm kind of pushing back against, is
Yeah.
the extent to which it's been used kind of outside of its lane, if that makes sense.
No, and this is a perfect commentary, Brandon, because that's exactly what motivated me to look into Darwinism in the first place. Not because of how it's used in the culture, not just in the culture, but in the humanities, in psychology and sociology, right? But if we want to cut the head off the monster, as it were, where it lives and breathes is not in the humanities departments, it's not in culture, it's in the biology departments, right? And so there's these competing, not competing, probably dual motivations for me. One is the apologetics task. Look how destructive this scientific theory has been to individuals' faiths, as an attack on Christianity, the way it, what is it, a universal acid, right? It dissolves all things, right? It
Mm-hmm.
dissolves this notion. Okay, so I was thinking about this. Um, I was thinking about this in terms of Darwinism's effect on culture, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we'll just do this really quickly. You see somebody's behavior online, right? Maybe some of this extreme woke stuff, and you see a person engaging that behavior. You go, that is a bad human being, right? Like a moldy loaf of bread. This has gone bad some way, right? But the notion that this behavior uh, is wrong for an individual, that comes back to the idea that there's some objective way that humans should be. And that means that there's something that it means to be human. There's an objective human nature. But if Darwinism is correct, then we only have the appearance of objectivity of human nature. There's no real objective metaphysical, let alone theological way that man should be.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, so Darwinism as a scientific theory, it affects things all the way down to making moral judgments on things going on currently in culture. So I definitely think that Darwinism needs to go, but but it's but on the other hand, I spent 2.5 years reading Darwinism and intelligent design materials, and I couldn't help thinking that these were ships passing one another. They're sort of
Hmm.
talking past one another. And then Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 says, "I become all things to all men that I might save some." And so I thought to myself, okay, in the mind of the scientist, not the scientist as atheist or as militant atheist, but just the scientist as he's thinking through the data and drawing his conclusions, how is he doing that? And this is where the philosophy of science comes in. You go, if a scientist won't give up his paradigm without an alternative paradigm, and intelligent design doesn't ask or answer the same set of questions, is it possible to build something that even an atheist scientist could accept that's also not Darwinism or non-Darwinian?
Okay, so with that as a great tease to the next chapter, can I just drill down into two questions based on what you just said? The
Sure.
first one is, in your video, you talked about how neo-Darwinism rests on 19th century assumptions. And I'm
Mhm.
curious what you meant by that, because of the statement that you just made where you said it definitely does need to go, but I don't know that we yet have explained why it needs to go. In other words, what do you see as problematic, fallacious, outdated, etc.
Yeah.
within that paradigm? Your household, statistically speaking, spends about $100 per month on products like soap, deodorant, those little vitamin C packets, etc. The problem is that most of us buy these products from places like Target, Amazon, and so on, businesses who take your $100 and then use a part of that money to fund causes, agendas and values that I'm pretty sure you're not happy with. My wife and I are now spending that same $100 a month at a different location that is made in America, devoid of these affiliations. It is a simple invitation for you to do the same. This is in no way a replacement of preaching the gospel or loving your neighbor. This is a small action. But if every subscriber to this channel, for example, actually made the switch, we would be taking like $900 million a month and moving it away from these culture damaging businesses. That's the point. That's why I'm doing this. And that's why I'm inviting you to do this as well. So if you're interested or curious at all to learn more, go to switchwithbrandon.com. Now back to the video.
Okay, so I was asked this one time, and it goes into a similar mode. And it's that an interviewer asked me, so if somebody, what would cause somebody who believes in Darwinism to give up Darwinism? And I said, nothing. You give up a paradigm because you think that there are problems with it, right? If you think that Darwinism is the be all end all, it crosses all the T's, it dots all the I's, then you're not motivated to look for an alternative. So Darwinism assumes, like I said, from Charles Lyell, it assumes gradualism, right? That small changes over geologic time can lead up to large changes. It assumes that this analogy, the mechanism starts off as an analogy with artificial breeding or artificial selection and makes it into a kind of natural selection, right? That's the mechanism. And then with the neo-Darwinism acting on genetic mutations, right? Then there's an assumption of a genealogical view of the fossil record. So you have an earlier fossil and you have a later fossil, and you say two fish, right? Two species of fish, and you see that there's a morphological similarity between fossil A and fossil B, even though there's, say, 20 or 30 million years between these two fossils. You say, well, given this morphological similarity, fossil A is the ancestor and fossil B is the descendant. That is imposing a genealogical view on the fossil record. That's not just saying we found a fossil here and we found a fossil there, right? It's saying
genealogical meaning what exactly?
Meaning a biological relationship, right? So like you have think of a personal genealogy.
Okay, got it.
Great grandparents, parents, you, siblings, children, right? So what the Darwinian paradigm is imposing on the fossil record is a view that when we find fossils with these kinds of similarities, they are biologically related in some genealogical way, as an ancestor to a descendant. Right? So morphological similarities, and we see this now in genetic similarities, and then finally ultimate common ancestry. That everything, all species of plants, animals, insects, mammals, birds, it all comes down to some initial. It would be the equivalent of the Big Bang, some initial singularity, some singular point, right? And so one of the aspects of my project, and so you say, well, why does Darwinism have to go? What's wrong with it? I think 40 years of intelligent design research has shown, Haeckel's embryos and the peppered moth, and there are all these.
Can we go into a couple of those if you don't mind? Just like bird's eye view, but people are going to go ahead and research this anyway. But if you have the nuts and bolts of it enough to kind of just help, because I know there's people right now that are listening going, no way, man, wrong. ID's done nothing. So just maybe at least tease some of these things for us.
Yeah. So let's see. I'm going back through the history of my personal library. So let's take Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box. Michael Behe in the 1970s, he's working as a biochemist. He's happy with his work, and then as he starts to learn more and more about evolutionary biology and its claims, because he's a working biochemist, he sees the incredible delicacy of these systems that were purportedly sort of slapped together by blind chance. And he was like, no, there's an elegance, and there's an intricacy, and there's a delicacy to this that couldn't have just uh, been cobbled together over geologic time, because you've got this whole lattice work of biochemical processes within a given system or subsystem. And if all of those processes don't work simultaneously together, or sequentially, but he goes, this whole system, the only way it makes sense is to put it together all at once, which is what an engineer does. It's not something that blind forces do, right? So that's a challenge to the efficacy or the explanatory scope of the mechanism
Mm-hmm.
of Darwinism. And then since the 1960s, there have been these mathematical challenges, right? These probabilistic challenges. So you know you may get into an argument with a friend and go, whoa, what are the odds that such and such event happens? Well, that's what Bill Dembski tackles. He says, okay, I'll tell you exactly what the odds are, because there's a discipline called mathematical statistics and information theory that deals specifically with this. And what he says, and sort of the argument would be something like this: um, all complex specified information, that is, information that has a level of complexity and specificity, like a language does or a code does, right? All complex specified information comes from an intelligent source. We don't see this kind of information arising randomly in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Every time we see this kind of coding, it comes from an intelligent source. DNA is a complex specified informational code. Therefore, DNA came from an intelligent source, right? There's nothing in there about quoting the book of Genesis. This isn't specifically creationism. It's an argument from what we do know about biology at the smallest levels, in terms of the genetic code as a code. And so I think this is where ID and the biologists, get at loggerheads, is that Dembski is analyzing the information in the code as a code and
Mm-hmm.
as information,
Mm-hmm.
and he's drawing fairly simple conclusions from that, but the conclusions fly in the face of a materialistic, naturalistic view. Now, I will say that I think it's right and proper that science adopts a methodological naturalism,
Mm-hmm.
right? I don't want scientists who are studying, say, cancer research to say, well, all of my samples were ruined because demons got into the lab and messed up my experiments, right? We don't, or the reason you should accept this research is because God told me to do this research, right? We don't want that. We want a measure of empirical objectivity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is what we do have in things like Dembski's research, which is why I think it is a science, and it's a science of information. It's not a biological science, which is why it doesn't directly compete with, and it can't replace, neo-Darwinism, because what we need is a different macro level view of the fossil record. And this might be a good place to delineate macro versus microevolution.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we look at, if you're asking people what are problems with evolution, there are no problems with evolution when it becomes empirical and testable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the events are, there's nothing anti-theistic about bacteria developing a resistance to antibiotics
Mm-hmm.
over time, right? Or a virus like malaria developing a resistance to antiviral measures, right? There's nothing anti-theistic about that. It's measurable, it's repeatable, it's testable. It's when you take those sorts of fairly limited empirical data points and say all of life on Earth comes back, uses these mechanisms, and you go, well, and then this is where, like I said, intelligent design comes in and goes, well, Behe has a challenge to the mechanism. Dembski has a challenge to the kind of probabilistic resources that the Darwinist has access to. But what is fundamentally at issue here is there another option? Is there another option that's acceptable on naturalistic grounds, but also could be acceptable on theistic grounds? And that's where I was headed with the post-Darwinian theory.
And is this before we get into that? The one other thing I wanted to just make sure was clear for myself and the listener is when you were talking about how the intelligent design community and the neo-Darwinianists are passing like ships in the night.
Mm-hmm.
Is what you were just saying? Are those examples of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Darwinist who's focused on the big picture of like, how do we interpret the last 700 million years of the fossil record? These genetic and the Richard Dawkins quote that I had in the video was the two most compelling lines of evidence are genetic and morphological similarities, right? And as we see this, and we do see a growing, increasing complexity in the fossil record of organisms over time, from less complex to more complex. We do see some overlapping similarities. And so it's not, this is the whole Paul in first, it's not completely irrational to think that Darwinism is a good explanation for that. But the first thing to note is how Darwinism's data set is different from like a physicist or a chemist, right? And so this is where I go back to a classical empiricism epistemology from Thomas Aquinas, and you say, how is it that humans come to know what things are, right? Humans come to know what things are by a process of induction. We have to see multiple instances of the same kind of thing to understand what something is. If somebody brought a piece of machinery into your room that you'd never seen before, what's your question?
What's it for?
What is that?
Yeah.
What is that? What does it do? Right? Mm-hmm. Because we typically name machines for their function. Refrigerator, toaster, right?
Right.
What does that do? It toasts things. It
Right.
refrigerates things, right? So if we've never seen something before, or we only have one instance of it and we don't see it function, we don't know what it is, right? The other thing is that humans have two different modes of deduction. We have mathematics and we have logic. And Darwinism is largely non-mathematical. It's largely narrative and qualitative. And so its mode of deduction to get from its premises to its conclusion is going to be largely logical, and therefore more heavily influenced by philosophy than something that like astronomy that's much more quantitatively rigorous. And so once you start asking these epistemological questions, and then go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what you just said. And again, listener, maybe you're with me, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe I'm the slowpoke here. But is it because of the narrative, the explanatory power that what you're kind of saying is stretched beyond what it can actually support, that you're putting it in this category that's different than astronomy? In other words, is it, you were talking about the fossil record as just one example, and is it because of the narrative attached to Darwinism that you're putting it in that separate category? Like, let me ask the question more simply. Why is Darwinism different than astronomy?
Okay. Yeah, good. That's clarified. So let me take it back a step even further. And the reason this question is important, the question is, what kind of science is, or what kind of paradigm is the neo-Darwinian paradigm? Mm-hmm. Right? And when we talk about kinds of paradigms, what I'm thinking of is the realism, anti-realism continuum in the philosophy of science. Strong realism meaning the theory that we're using uh, tells us what exists, how it exists in a literally true fashion, and the language is literal, not metaphorical. All the way to an extreme anti-realism, which would be science has never given us the truth about the world in literal language. It's only a puzzle solving project. And one generation of science leaves a bunch of puzzles, and the next generation of science tries to figure out what those puzzles are. But it's not the aim of science to tell us about ultimate reality or reality at all, right? So those are sort of the broad ends of a realism anti-realism spectrum. The question is, um, most scientists are realists, right? Because they're not philosophers of science. They're not asking about the nature of science largely. They're just doing science, and they're assuming that their science, that their theory is telling them what's real and true and literal about the world. Okay. J.P. Moreland, in his Christianity and the Nature of Science, 1999, he says, "Well, I think we should adopt an eclecticism where we evaluate scientific paradigms on a case by case basis, rather than just saying I'm a scientific realist or I'm a scientific anti-realist, which many philosophers of science do." And then he goes on and he goes, I don't really know how to flesh this out yet. And so one of the things that I did in my project is I go, oh, okay. Given my studies in Thomism, I think I know how to build Moreland's eclecticism from these basic principles in epistemology. And so that was the first thing to do, is go, okay, let's build out a principled eclecticism. This is the way humans know things. And then based on that, induction, mathematics, logic. Now this gets back to your question, how is neo-Darwinism different than some of these other sciences? And you go, well, what is the nature of the data? Right? The reason I'm what's called a structural realist when it comes to, say, quantum mechanics or cosmology is because the data is so precise in its quantification. It may not tell us robustly what exactly is going on at the quantum level, but we know what is going on. We may not know how and why, but we know what. And we know what to like 9 places past the decimal point in precision, right? Mm-hmm. So if you ask a physicist, why do you believe this or that, he'll probably start writing equations on the chalkboard, right? Mm-hmm. Chalkboard, mm-hmm. Whiteboard. But if you ask, so that's the difference between, say, physics and chemistry, is that the data set lends itself to a precise quantification and a reproducibility. How do you know that this group of scientists in Australia had a breakthrough? Well, it's because the guys at Caltech were able to reproduce it with the same results, right? There's an inductive process. Yeah.
So is it essential within that distinction, the fact that Darwinism is dealing with the past? It's like a historical study of things that cannot be repeated in the same way, because by definition, the theory says that these things take a long, long time. And the only way that you could really repeat it is if you actually lived long enough to actually observe all of it happen. Something like that?
Right. Yes. Okay. So that's the first part, is that the data set for Darwinism isn't reproducible. So imagine how much. I was just watching a documentary on sharks with my wife the other day.
Was it which one was it?
It was on Netflix.
About the girl Ocean.
That was one of the ones that we watched.
Okay, that was cool. One.
Yeah, I was freaked out by some of the stuff she does. But
same.
I mean, holding her breath for 6.5 minutes, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
But I mean, they basically said that real, up to even the 70s, and I watched another documentary on the movie Jaws, and the movie Jaws actually kicked off a branch of marine biology that was interested in studying sharks and their behavior. But I mean, as recent as the 1970s, we really didn't understand a lot about sharks, because how do you understand something about what a species is? You follow it through its life cycle, through its mating habits, its gestational periods, its migration habits,
Mm-hmm.
its feeding and breeding habits, right? None of that is open to the fossil evidence, right? So we have this very, very acute lack of inductive access. We can't see these things in their natural light. Compounding that is that much of this evidence, even at the individual level, is fragmented, right? It may be a piece of a jawbone of a species, right? A guy named David Ropp, back in 1995, had an article where he said that there are like 330 or 360 different species of reptiles, dinosaurs, right?
Mm-hmm.
He said of those 300 plus species, a full 50% of them are known from a single specimen.
Mm-hmm.
And then those specimens individually aren't fully preserved. And you go, okay, wait. Based on my epistemology and the way I think humans know what things are, it raises a huge red flag. How do you know what this thing is when you only have one example of it? You don't see it in its living environment, and that sample itself is fragmented.
Mm-hmm.
So now in the past, 20 years ago, someone would have come on here. Well, if social media had existed, someone would have come on here and said, "See, this proves that Darwinism is false."
Mm-hmm.
And my point is this: that's the wrong attitude toward this evidence. What it shows is that the conclusions that the Darwinists draw are based heavily on the assumptions that are brought to those brought to that data.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of the point that I make in my book is that given our understanding of how humans know things and the kind of data set that the Darwinists are dealing with, should we be more realist about the theory or more anti-realist about the theory? Do we think it tells us what literally lived in the past and how it, or do we think that there's something that, and this is where Bos van Frossen's constructive empiricism comes in, where Van Frossen says his particular brand of anti-realism is that the organization of the data largely arises to a significant degree in the mind of the scientist and is imposed on the data.
Right.
And so it's the assumptions of the scientist imposed on the data that give it the organization that it has, rather than a robust empirical reading the data off of nature, which is what we're used to in these more realist sciences like physics and chemistry.
That makes a lot of sense. It's almost like I'm picturing, as you're saying that in my mind, like a building that is made up of, thousands of bricks, and it's like we actually know for sure that this brick is here. We actually have a lot of questions and mark about these ones, and then another one for sure is here, and then there's a bunch of more kind of grayed out question
Yeah.
mark bricks and there, and it's sort of like if you zoom out and look at the whole building, maybe you have. I mean, I would be curious what percentage you would give of bricks in my analogy, my weird analogy, are representative of factual matters
Right.
related to Darwinism, and then the sort of gaps are everything that we're kind of stretching to get from here to here, and then you look at the whole shape of the building and you go, oh, that's a tower, I see what that is, that's got a parapet and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
But it's actually not every brick is really there, or something like that. Maybe that's a weird analogy, but
No. That's close to my own thinking, and the way I've thought of it is a mosaic. So you have
okay.
all these individual tiles,
Okay, yeah.
and and you go, well, what was the original picture? And you go, well, estimates are that from all the species that have ever lived, we have somewhere between 1 and, at the most generous, like 15%
Mm-hmm.
fossilized, right? So that means that even in the most generous estimate, 85% of the data set is missing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's spread out over hundreds of millions of years. So you see a mosaic that is made up of little, say, hexagonal tiles, and there's only 15% of them that are colored in, and they're spread out throughout the whole mosaic, maybe
Yeah.
little clusters.
Mm-hmm.
And then basically what the Darwinist is doing is they're coming with their paintbrush and they're filling in the rest of the picture. And you go, okay, that's fine that you do that, but you should lower the hubris here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Are you telling me that this is literally what the original picture looked like? And what kind of confidence do I have that that's accurate?
And then you're saying that the intelligent design community is doing a good job at exposing those painted areas for what they are, that they are actually gaps that are being filled by faith or something, but not
Yeah.
actual hard data. But to merely expose something in that manner is not the same as to present an entirely whole cloth mural of your own.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Um, so the ID guys came in uh, and they basically pointed at what that was and said, "That's wrong. You don't know everything that you say you know, and we have the receipts to show why you don't know everything that you say you know, because some of the explanations that you give for why you painted it this way are extremely porous, and some of them are really weak. But the public doesn't know this, so we're going to expose this."
Hmm.
And so that's, I mean, for the last 40 years, that's been a I think the project of ID. And then the Christian community has been extremely welcoming to the ID literature because it confirms our predisposition toward theism.
But I think also it's because of the lack of intellectual integrity that has been afoot when it comes to saying, look at this mural, it completely does away with the need for God as an explanation.
Yeah,
Look at this mural. You guys are all in the dark ages for disagreeing with it because it is fully intact and every piece is fully data driven. And so I don't think it's just out of a I don't think it's only for the reason that you said, but I also think, like, for me, frankly, like, it's frustrating to talk to people who believe that evolution, which I know is like such a broad term, we're talking about so much more.
sure.
But if you just go to the streets and you say, "Is evolution a fact?" They would say it's the most factual thing that we possibly know, and every individual that you talk to would have a different explanation for that. But the broad idea, from my perspective, that exists in culture is that there's a lot more meat on the bones than there actually is, or there's a lot more.
Yeah.
Do you follow what I'm saying? And it's
Yeah, that's right.
It's for the sake of accuracy and precision. I love that word that you used earlier. And basically, what is actually true that I care, not again because I don't view it in either sense as competing with God, because I think that, like you said, it's one, like the zoology, biology, this is like one specific area that is important, but it doesn't have anything to do with the origin of the universe. It doesn't have anything to do with, I mean, explaining a lot of things, right? So in my mind, it is in its own lane no matter what, and therefore will never be broad enough to actually compete with the God hypothesis.
Yeah.
I just more care about what is true within
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, and so going back to your point, I think the rhetorical value, the value in persuasive argument, is for the person who thinks that evolution is a fact.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and I we've been married 26 years, so we have these little shorthand phrases from our time together. And one of the things I will say sometimes is she'll say, "Well, I wonder why that," and I'll just say it's a bodybuilding contest, and she'll go, "Oh, okay." And what we mean by that is because both of us have a fitness background. Any bodybuilder that you see by themselves in the gym they're huge, they're ripped, right. It's only when you put them on a stage next to each other, you go, oh, that guy's bigger, that guy's more well defined,
Mm.
right? So similarly, for somebody who says no, Darwinism is a fact, just like any other science, you go, okay, well, let's do an analysis. Let's do a realism, anti-realism analysis of the different sciences. And then if we can put them next to each other, you'll see that neo-Darwinism, the data set that it has, the way it deals with its data, it's not as rigorous as these other sciences. So in terms of like a bodybuilding contest, Darwinism is kind of the fat boy on stage.
That's a great analogy. I love that shorthand, and I won't soon forget that. What one last thought before I know we're moving on to post Darwinism in a second, but
Mhm.
it struck me as comical that in a sense that single bone that is then extrapolated by the imagination and artistry of the human person who turns it
Mhm.
into a full dinosaur is almost like a microcosm of certain aspects of the broader discipline, if that makes sense. Like in the same way, to use your not tapestry, but your mural analogy, it's almost
Mhm.
like what do you call that in math? Sorry, I'm a little all over the place here, but what do you call that where you have what do you call that? And then you zoom in and it's the exact same thing, and then you zoom in again, and it's the exact same thing.
Oh, a fractal.
A fractal. It's almost like a fractal
Mhm.
in a sense that. Anyways, so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, this is actually a good point. It reminded me of something that Jonathan Wells brings up, and he was talking about there was a convention. The details are vague, but something like this. The main point is this: there was a convention. There was this facsimile, this stuffed kind of half reptile, half bird, thing that a taxidermist kind of put
Mm-hmm.
together.
Mm-hmm.
And when they asked the artist who put the thing together, they said, well, they told me that it was somewhere between a reptile and a bird. So I gave it eagle's eyes and I gave it this kind of shape and feathers and whatever. You go, well, the the and then if you were to look at the actual bones in the earth, you don't get any of that from it. This is just the way in which Darwinian art impacts the public. And you go, oh well, if you can make an artistic rendering of it, you go, yeah, but the the rendering itself was informed by these assumptions in the theory, not directly from the data.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. You just
Yeah,
said it properly, so thank you for that. So
yeah,
uh, so post Darwinism or post neo Darwinism, basically your thesis, what you're kind of advocating for, what does that look like, and what do you think is a good path forward or a better way of thinking about all of this?
yeah. So the first thing that we have to say is, um, going back to the realism anti-realism spectrum. You go, if we're going to develop an alternative to neo-Darwinism, shouldn't we know what kind of theory we're replacing? Because if neo-Darwinism is what Van Frosten calls an empirical construct, right, where it's the assumptions that are the most important part, and the data sort of comes secondary, then we don't have to replace Darwinism with some robust, empirical, literally true paradigm. We just need an alternative construct, which first and foremost means we need an alternative set of assumptions, right, to frame the data. I'm doing this because of the empty square thing that I have in my video.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually see indicators of this in the history of paleontology, and one of the things I go to is um, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge in their article on punctuated equilibrium in 1972. In the abstract, Gould and Eldridge say that paleontology has been locked into an assumption of gradualism that isn't really borne out by the data. And so they developed their punctuated equilibrium where they're perfectly content with the idea that the fossil record or the paleontological record displays long periods of stasis and then short bursts of change. So, um, from my philosophical perspective, I go, okay, stop right there.
Mhm.
What just happened? Did the scientific community unearth a new geologic layer with a bunch of different fossils and then change their mind? No. Gould and Eldridge just decided that they weren't going to be beholden to one specific assumption in the Darwinian paradigm, and so they modified it by changing out that assumption. So if you look at what we said about the assumptions that go into neo-Darwinism, gradualism, a genealogical view of the fossil record, ultimate common ancestry, natural selection acting on random mutation as the main mechanism.
You're calling all of those assumptions?
Well, the first three are assumptions, and the last one is the proposed mechanism.
Okay.
So gradualism, a genealogical view of the fossil record, and everything coming down to ultimate common ancestry. Those are the assumptions. So that, ultimate common ancestry grounds a genealogical view, because if everything came from a single origin, then everything is related. Those relations can usually be picked up by either morphological or genetic similarities, right? And then that happened gradually over time because of the mechanism is natural selection acting on random mutation, right? So then we go, okay, well, what does it look like to give up those assumptions in favor of non-Darwinian assumptions or anti-Darwinian assumptions? Instead of gradualism, you have something like Gould and Eldridge's punctuated equilibrium, that it's perfectly reasonable to read the fossil record in I would say, a more literal way, where things don't change for a long time and then you see rapid periods of change, right? Then if you have let's skip because we said that ultimate common ancestry grounds the genealogical view. I want to jump down to Christian Schwab's chemical view of the origin of life. And going back to what we said earlier is that Darwin starts his origin of life, and 19th century, he starts his origin of life view from a single cell, and then he starts his biological view from there. Everything branches out into this tree of life. Okay. So I was reading a book by a guy named Christian Schwab called Genomic Potential, the Genomic Potential Hypothesis. Schwab is a chemist, and he says about the origin of life, and this, I was pretty enthralled by chemistry when I was an undergrad, never pursued it, but took a real interest. And so when Schwab said this, it blew me away because I never thought about it. He said, if life was a chemical event, right? This is what Richard Dawkins and atheist biologists are going to hold to all day long, that life was a purely chemical event on naturalistic principles. Schwab says, okay, if life was a chemical event, it happened on the molar scale. That is 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd, because that's how chemical reactions run. You're not going to get, and since we've descended below the level of the cell into chemistry, now we have Schwab's view saying that basically this: diversity, biological diversity, is an initial condition that started at the origin of life. It's not something biological diversity is not something that grows up in a tree. It starts out as a forest. So what's super interesting about that, as a thesis, is if you have a chemical origin of life, that means that genetic and morphological similarities don't necessarily give you any clue to heredity or genealogy. Which means that it destroys, or at least it undercuts, a genealogical view of paleontology. And you go, just because species A and species B look a lot alike, there is no guarantee that they're even remotely related. They could have completely independent world lines.
Now, is there any data pointing in the direction of that hypothesis, or is he just saying there's as much data for this as there is for Darwin's idea, given that no one was there at ground zero?
I think what he's saying is this, that he's looking at neo-Darwinism starting its theory at the level of the cell. And he's saying if life starts at the level of chemistry rather than at the level of the cell, then none of the other Darwinian assumptions make any sense, or at least they all fall like dominoes. Because the clue to heredity for the Darwinists is similarities. But if you can obtain similarities, at least theoretically, if you can obtain similarities um, on chemical grounds and not biological grounds, then they may not be clues to heredity or genealogy at all.
I see.
Now, so my proposal is that this kind of view. Okay, so then you have what's called the extended evolutionary synthesis. You have people like Massimo Pigliucci and Gerd Mueller who are working on things like epigenetics and genomic plasticity, right? And they're trying sort of in two different moods. They're trying to sort of break away from orthodox Darwinian assumptions, but they're also trying to stay tethered somewhat to the modern synthesis of the 1940s, right? They're trying to extend the evolutionary thesis, but they're really doing things that are inherently anti-Darwinian. So my what I say is that we already have all of the pieces in place for a non-Darwinian construct. Schwab's chemical assumption of the origin of life gives rise to a non-genealogical view of the fossil record. Two fossils may look similar and yet have different origins. And actually, Darwinists already admit this to some degree because they admit something called convergent evolution, right? So, like the human eye and the eye of the great squid are extremely similar, but we know on other by other means that humans and squids don't have the same genealogical origins. And so they go, okay, well, look how powerful evolution is. It can converge on extremely similar organs from completely disparate lines. You go, okay, well, this model exacerbates that in a way that it annihilates genealogy. So we have a non-genealogical fossil record, and then it actually maps onto the sort of metamorphosis genomic plasticity view, actually maps onto a punctuated equilibrium model. So those assumptions, that actually
you,
is a good.
I'm sorry, Dr. Bridges. Can you just unpack that last sentence, that last statement that you made about what maps on to what, and can you just unpack that a little bit for me?
Okay, yeah. So the idea of let's say genomic plasticity, that genomics looks at genomics looks at genetics of an entire organism sort of holistically.
Mm-hmm.
And genomic plasticity says that you can have not natural selection acting on random mutation in order to change a species and its gene expression, but you can have large chunks of the genome change into new functional expressions for the species. That maps better onto a punctuated view of the fossil record.
I see.
So what Mueller and Pigliucci are getting at, it actually maps onto a non-Darwinian paradigm better than it does this sort of orthodox or even neo-Darwinistic view of the history of life. Now, keep in mind, we're coming at this from a empirical constructivist anti-realism. That is, whatever we replace neo-Darwinism with isn't going to be literally true because we just don't have the data for that. Remember the mosaic.
Mm-hmm.
The mosaic is still largely empty.
Mm-hmm.
We're just using the same data points and painting a different picture because we're imposing different assumptions. Now,
mm-hmm.
The subtitle is so that's the post-Darwinism of the post-Darwinian design theory. Now, when we already have a relationship like this already established in Christian apologetics. It's with the Big Bang cosmology, right? So an atheist is going to come along and say, he's going to look at Big Bang cosmology and say, yeah, that's just maybe one universe in an infinite number of universes in the multiverse, right? Somebody like a William Lane Craig is going to come along and go, no, given the anthropic principles and whatever, the better explanation for the nature of our known universe is mind. It's a mind that transcends time, space, matter, energy, right? With this new post-Darwinian model in place, the question then becomes exactly where you sort of you got there ahead of me. The question then becomes, okay, Schwab's view of the origin of life, is it best understood naturalistically or theistically?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you have Bill Dembski and Stephen Meyer, especially, working on the information required at the level of the origin of life. And you go, okay, so this is what, so Schwab has a genomic potential paradigm, which I think wraps in punctuated equilibrium, and it wraps in some of the assumptions of the extended evolutionary synthesis. Um, and and he rests his paradigm on an assumption of naturalism,
Mm-hmm.
metaphysically. I think we can have what I call a genomic design paradigm, where we have those same elements uh, about natural history, but resting on theism, and the justification for that is what the intelligent design guys have been doing all along. The informational analysis, the inability of chemistry to produce complex specified information,
Mm-hmm.
the eliminating eliminating chance through small probabilities. What are the odds that something like this could have come about on purely naturalist? It's just
Yeah.
it's exactly the kind of thing that that moved Anthony Flew from atheism to at least philosophical theism. He was just like it was the probabilistic reasoning about the origin of life.
Yeah, like maybe we can mention, just to put a little bit more texture to that, like if you wouldn't, I don't know if this is maybe a tall order off the top of your head, but what's coming to mind when you're talking about the mathematical and probabilistic issues with a materialistic explanation of everything would be like the protein folds and the combinatorial problem that
Yeah,
I've heard Stephen Meyer talk about, which when he
yeah,
explained that, I actually made a video about that like a year ago, and a lot of people were like, wow, I've really never understood the actual mathematical problems with saying that it is really happening in an undirected way, and how basically he gave the analogy of like islands that are millions of miles apart from each other in the ocean.
yeah,
And so anyways, I just or anything else that you think. I just always love, because you have a dense vocabulary, and I always want to kind of, like, as much as we can, pause at something like the statement that you just made to give an example, so that someone can kind of get a sense for what we're talking about in a bit more detail.
yeah. Well, I'll take a stab at two different issues. One of the things that Stephen Meyer shows in his Signature in the Cell, is the reason that chemical necessity is not a good explanation for the kind of information we see in DNA. So DNA, we have ATGC all matching up, and uh, the phosphate backbone of DNA. I think that's right. Um, it accepts any of the nucleic acids, right? Um, if there were a chemical necessity as to what nucleic acid could bind, um, it couldn't function as a code, right? Because A would be locked into a specific spot, and it would have to go there, and it wouldn't have the freedom required to create the kind of complex code that we need for DNA to function the way it is. So that's kind of the linear improbability, right? What you're getting at with the protein folds is going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, and I think this is work based on what Doug Axe has been doing, and he found that it's 1 in 10 to the 77th functional folded proteins, and that is not only is there a sort of a linear coding issue, but the topography of the shape that an enzyme or a protein takes in order to receive in order to do its chemical function as a catalyst or whatever. that also has a level of complexity and improbability to it. So that, I mean, so when we are criticized for accepting a God of the gaps, sort of, it's not that we don't know something about nature and we're compelled to believe that God did it. It's because of the things that we're actively seeing in nature, and it's because of the increasing mathematical precision with which we know these things and their functionalities that compels us to go, this is beyond mere chemical forces. That there has to be some intelligence that engineers this, basically.
Yeah, that I think that's such a great distinction. Like, just to use maybe one analogy that's really maybe not perfect and simple, but we know where these come from, right? Like we know, like
Yeah.
who, and so it's like if we send a space probe to a galaxy far, far away, and we see an iPhone sitting on the surface of that planet, or even a factory that produces them, like we are going to think that it's possible that there might be some other intelligence in the universe
Yeah.
responsible for this because we know that we created it. There's gonna be newspaper headlines along those lines
Right.
if
Yeah.
we find an iPhone factory on the the dark side of the moon or whatever. We're not going to just say this is amazing how this developed naturalistically. Like we're just not going to that's not going to be the headline on the newspaper. Is all I'm saying.
Right.
Which for similar reasons as what you're saying with it, with information and like specified information, functional information, and intelligence.
Yep.
So when Stephen Meyer helped me realize that same basically because people say God of the gaps. You go, oh no, you're right. We're saying we don't know, therefore God did it. Oh, you've really got me. And then realizing that it is not in any way that type of reasoning, I think is
Right.
helpful.
Well, and that's why I like the sort of the positive syllogism of Dembski's work. All complex specified information comes from intelligence. The information in the DNA code is complex specified information, therefore it comes from intelligence. And actually, one of the writers says that intelligent design actually uses the term intelligence generically.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say God.
Mm-hmm.
It just says that for all we know, this stuff has to come from an intelligent source, which is why Dawkins could admit, oh, maybe aliens seeded life here or something like that.
Right.
Because intelligent design uses the term intelligence generically.
Yeah, I was talking with Hugh Ross, who tells the story of being at a conference, a science conference, and on the fourth day or whatever of the conference, they were basically kind of going down that path of panspermia. And I think he was sitting next to Fuzz Rana. I don't know if you know him or not. And they were kind of joking with each other. They're like, I think they're starting to get warm in terms of
because Fuzz is a biochemist, so
right.
Yeah.
And they were kind of joking, like they were like, I think that in an ironic kind of backdoor manner, they're actually starting to get warm in terms. But it's funny the direction that this conference. It was actually a conference on chemical evolution. I think I don't remember exactly what it was, but basically they were like, now there is like, they were kind of like, hear me out, and they were kind of going down the panspermia direction, and then these two theists are like, I think that you're right that there could be an off-planet, highly intelligent entity capable of doing all this. Like, I think we're very close to each other here.
Yeah. Hugh and Fuzz are played warmer, colder.
Yeah, exactly.
Scientists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, anyways, okay, I'm off the beaten path. Where should we go from here?
Well, so at the very end of all of this, most Christians, I think, if they're thoughtful, are going to ask, well, okay, genomic potential as an alternative construct for neo-Darwinism, genomic design as the theistic version of that, but what about the Bible? And right, because we left creationism aside, and so actually, it's okay if I pull a book off my shelf?
Do it.
Yeah. Okay. So this is John Lennox's 7 Days to Divide the World, and on page 55, we are considering the idea that the 6 days encompass a sequence of creation acts, each of which involved at least one creative fiat introduced by the phrase, "and God said." At each stage of creation, God injected a new level of information and energy into the cosmos in order to advance creation to its next level of form and complexity. One consequence of this is that we would expect to find what the geologists tell us that we do find: fossil evidence revealing sudden appearance of new levels of complexity, followed by periods in which there's no more creation. So we went from neo-Darwinism as not literally true, but an empirical construct, to a replacement empirical construct, the genomic potential hypothesis, to a theistic version, the genomic design view, which sees this sort of paleontological construct from a theistic lens, to John Lennox's offering that this is potentially one way to read the book of Genesis, is that every time Genesis says, "and God said," that indicates an epoch where God is injecting new levels of information and complexity.
Yeah.
So this, I think, runs the gambit in terms of, do we have at least one biblically orthodox representation of what I'm calling a genomic design paradigm would be? And I think that's it. So I think because there's nothing that necessarily secures orthodoxy when you start to pontificate philosophically.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's quite possible to start out with well-intentioned and end up in some place outside the bounds of orthodoxy. And we don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We want to theorize in ways that are helpful and clear and consistent and true. But we also want to find ourselves within orthodoxy.
Now, there's a way of hearing what you just said as if what you're saying is that we're not willing to follow the truth where it leads because we're moored in this book called the Bible. And so we're afraid to really earnestly seek the truth. I don't think that's what you're saying, in the sense that I think that they're like, who was it? You probably know. I think it was Galileo, who talked about the two books, the book of nature,
yeah,
and the revelation of God in Scripture, like not general revelation and specified revelation, and just the idea that these two will actually align if they are from the same source. If the author of Scripture is also the author of nature and reality, then we should have zero concern around where we'll end up in the pursuit of truth in the book of nature. If the hypothesis is true that both Scripture and nature are derivative of God, basically.
Yeah. I had a philosophy of religion professor in seminary, and the way he said it was this: nature and Scripture will never conflict because they have the same author.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He said, but science is an interpretation of nature, and theology is an interpretation of Scripture.
Mm.
And science and theology can conflict because they're competing, they're conflicting interpretations. So what I would say is, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to theorize in science as clearly and consistently as possible, and in this case, utilizing tools from the history and philosophy of science to help that along. And we're trying to theorize in our theology. We're trying to, and this is why I saved John Lennox to the end, because John is not trying to build a safe haven for my genomic design theory. He's just trying to give the reader access to the continuum, the spectrum of orthodox positions that believe that God literally created the earth and created life on the earth, and that Genesis reflects that in some way. Now the question becomes, in what way does Genesis reflect that? Right. You have the literal 6-day creation, 10,000 years ago view, and that's not the only view. So John is just sort of trying to represent, and what I found as a happy conclusion is that all of this fairly rigorous philosophical, scientific sort of uh, delineation. Oh, look, I happily have found in John independently a view of Scripture that could sort of bridge the gap between this sort of arid philosophical environment and God's revelation. And so it says, okay, well, this is my interpretation of the sciences, and this is my interpretation of Scripture, and I found a way, at least in this case, where my theology that is interpreting the Scripture and my philosophy science that's interpreting nature can conjoin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, people are going to go, no, you've missed it here, here, and here. There are conflicts that you haven't resolved, and that's fine. I'm just adding my voice to the conversation in hopes that we can move things along and that we can perhaps have an epistemological clarity that we haven't had previously.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And that view actually does also remind me of Hugh Ross, who spends a lot of time talking about and writing about some of those different interpretations of Genesis, and even like literary devices, and the concept that things are written from different perspectives. There's like a third person omniscient perspective. There's the perspective sort of the earth plane. What would the human person have been perceiving? A lot of the language in the Old Testament, you kind of need to have some of those frameworks in mind. But which I actually think is important. I mean, I'm young enough to just have the convenience of not being settled on any of it really.
Sure.
But the idea that I think what you're saying, or part of what you're saying, is that it's important for people to understand the idea that there are different legitimate interpretations of some of these things in the Bible, and that you're not twisting the meaning of Scripture in order to make it compatible with the interpretation of nature, but actually there's a legitimate interpretation of nature, which we're calling a scientific theory, and there's a legitimate interpretation of Scripture, which we're calling, I guess, maybe like whatever you would call Linux's viewpoint there. But the point is, they're both actual, like, it's not like scientific heresy and biblical heresy are great bedfellows. Look at this, we solved the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Like, yeah. That's interesting.
And I will say this, that there's this adage that I've heard that if you get it wrong in the beginning, you'll get it wrong in the end. And so that, if we get origins wrong, if we get our interpretation of Genesis wrong, our theology is just going to go off the wayside. I think that's wrong-headed, and I think it's wrong-headed because there's a so there's the getting it right in the beginning. There's a chronological sense, which is what it's being taken as, if we get it right in the beginning of the chronology of human history. But that's not the absolute beginning of our theology. Our theology stands and falls with Christ, his identity, his death and resurrection. That's the beginning, right? And it's if we get that wrong, all of our theology goes wrong.
Well, and what's funny about that is that, well, tell me if you agree that in a certain sense that kind of throws a wrench in the whole project that we were just talking about, in that the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is a miracle.
Yeah.
And so what I mean by that is that although there's historic evidence that I would say powerfully points to that it really did happen, there still is the requirement of an openness to a miracle. If you preclude that possibility as an a priori, then you obviously will not follow the historic evidence to that conclusion. You'll string together different explanations. But what I'm saying is, how we're talking about like the book of Scripture and the book of nature and sort of how they fit together, there's a sense in which, and this is the whole, anyways, this might be a whole other trail, but like miracles, like Hume's argument against miracles was very poor.
Sure.
But a lot of people think along those types of lines.
Yeah.
today in the conversation in the comments section of this YouTube channel, people think Hume had an amazing argument against miracles, and they think according to it, and so therefore miracles are impossible. And so therefore, if what you just said is true, that at the center of Christianity, of biblical theology, isn't in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, then I can understand how that could throw a wrench into someone's. I could see how that could be a stumbling block. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I think the assumption there is that we can believe in the resurrection without first believing in God as creator.
Right.
And I think the little change that I would make is this. Um, at Southern Evangelical Seminary, we're classical apologists, and what that means is that the first thing that you have to establish is what kind of universe you live in, theistic or atheistic or pantheistic or whatever. So we don't use miracles as evidence for God's existence. We establish God's existence on other grounds, right? Some of those grounds could be scientific.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer grounds that are more philosophical, existential,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or you could use the moral argument, right? So you could use a moral argument and get someone to believe, yeah, objective morality exists, therefore God has to exist. And if God exists, then miracles are possible,
Okay.
like the resurrection.
Okay, so
right?
we're on the same page. Actually, I
Yeah.
I misunderstood you. I thought you were saying the resurrection happened,
No,
therefore God exists. Not
Oh no, no. What I mean is, in our personal theology, um, as we're looking at the days of Genesis and science and philosophy, and trying to hone in on what we think exactly these passages mean or whatever, um, it's perfectly possible to get those things wrong.
Mhm.
What was created on what day and what this means for natural history and whatever. We can get those things perfectly wrong, but still not go astray in our theology, because at the center of our theology, what we get right in the beginning of our theology is who Jesus is, what he did for us, how he paid for that, the relationship that he brings us into the Father, right? So the adage of if you get it wrong in the beginning, you'll get it. The beginning of what? The beginning of the chronology of human history and God's creative fiat there, or the beginning of the centrality of who Jesus is and what he commands us.
I see.
Right. And so I would lean toward the latter. Like, we can get wrong God's relationship with the created order in the level of like scientific specificity that we're trying to go after.
Right.
We can get that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And our theology is perfectly fine because we're centered in who is Jesus. What is Paul telling us in Romans? When I came to faith, my dad was very dialed into eschatology, right? It's the thing he was focused on.
Yep.
So when I got saved, I was like, started studying eschatology. And then I got to seminary and realized we can get that stuff wrong. We can get all of that stuff grossly wrong and still live a robustly Christian life if we get all the rest of this stuff right.
That makes a ton of sense. Two quick thoughts just as parentheticals. It would be so cool to have a conversation between someone like a Stephen Meyer and then a neo-Darwinist, with you sort of almost helping to translate and kind of, in other words, if these two ships pass in the night, how to facilitate a conversation where that doesn't happen and where terms are defined and there is some sense of acknowledgement of the limitations of each of those paradigms and so on and so forth. I think that could be super interesting. So that's just one idea.
I would love that. The difficulty is, I watched Brett Weinstein on with Tucker Carlson.
Oh yeah,
and Brett is brother of Eric Weinstein, and he's got a PhD in evolutionary biology. And as intelligent and informed as he is in evolutionary biology, that doesn't give him much training at all in terms of like a philosophical analysis along epistemology of science lines, leading to a discussion about philosophy of religion issues.
But that's kind of my point. Is that
Yeah,
everyone is an expert in a really
sure.
narrow modality, and being able to say like
Yeah,
this and this, and how do you actually talk across the aisle in a way that is
yeah.
I don't know, fruitful in some way. I don't know, maybe that's
No,
impossible.
yeah, no, not impossible. It just and if anybody, I think Brett Weinstein would have the disposition to engage with something like that.
Yeah, I
He
really,
just seems to be very measured.
if anyone in the
In
comments has a connection point to Brett Weinstein, then follow the email that is in the description of this YouTube channel and see if we can make this happen, because I think that would be really, really cool. Like, I would love to see him and Stephen Meyer talk with you as a moderator, and me just eating popcorn the whole time.
yeah.
Okay, so my other thought, what was my other thought? Now I've lost it. So that was inside of the parentheses. The other thing I was gonna, what were we just talking about before I went to that? My goodness,
Centrality of Christ and theology.
Christ and theology.
Eschatology being
Oh my goodness.
origins and eschatology being tangential to the centrality of faith.
Oh no, I think I just what you were saying. Okay, I just remembered it. That what I just pitched to came downstream from what I'm about to say, and it's just
Okay.
the idea of, I have not really had any young Earth creationists on this channel, and I would love to. So that was the other thing I was going to say, is if anybody has access to a Ken Ham or someone, I actually want to have that conversation as well. And what I was thinking is, man, it'd be great to facilitate not debates, but just conversations, even around like the 7 days of Genesis. It's like, hey, let's compare notes here. And can we do it in a manner that doesn't necessarily have to get all heated? Can it just be, that's really interesting, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't realize that. And so on and so forth. Because frankly, I think that there is, like you were saying, like if we hold the essential things together, then we are brothers and on the same team and all of that. And yet I seem to see a lot of sparks flying around Genesis, the beginning of Genesis and all that type of thing as well. So I just think that there is a huge need for thinking along the lines that you have articulated here, where it's like zooming out, looking at a paradigm, actually examining the shape of it and the extent of it, and sort of like analyzing things in that way while keeping it civil, right? Rather than, so anyways, that was the connection there.
Well, I think Hugh Ross would be an amazing person to engage. He's done it at some of our national conferences, engaged with some of the young Earth guys. And he has both the knowledge and the gentlemanliness, I suppose. Hugh's just the most gentle person, unflappable, I think, is probably a good description of Hugh.
Yes.
So he's done a lot of that work on the biblical text. I'm not a biblical theologian. Which is why I use Hugh and John Lennox as my stalking horses in terms of like, how do I hook on this stuff onto scripture. But Hugh would be a good candidate for that.
Yeah, I'm definitely a fan of his. Like I said, I'm young enough to have the privilege of saying like, that sounds great, but I really want to do my best to compare notes from people across the aisle and not just say like, he wooed me and I'm all in on everything that Hugh has to say. Like, I'm not a scientist. I'm like I said, young enough to, I think, just kind of want to really hear out all sides and wonder like why are there such large camps on both sides of this? Let's like really try to hear both sides out and then put both sides together and communicate about the differences. Dr. Bridges, thank you so much for your time. This has actually been, I need to go for like a run or something just to kind of let all this sink in.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
You bet.
If you enjoyed this conversation, you might also enjoy the Wisdom Society. Join today, support this channel, invest in yourself, grow in faith, connect with believers from around the world. Click the link in the description to find out more.